Welcome! My name is Rachel. I have never made a YouTube video before. I am completely new to YouTube, but I have been watching a lot of other booktubers lately and I've just been so inspired by them that I thought, why not make a booktuber video? I've been a part of the booktube community for a while, as in I've been watching a lot of booktubers for a while, from, Polanda Books and Jessie the Reader and Sasha Eilsberg, to now like Destiny and Sarah and Haley. I feel like I've been around long enough that I've been watching booktube that I've been inspired, okay? I've been inspired to do this. There's no official setup. I'm filming this on my phone. You're on a pile of books. None of this is planned or really put together other than I just really wanted to do this. Something that I have noticed with a lot of the now booktubers, a lot of romance booktubers, which is great. I love romance. It's how I found them. But a lot of booktubers are starting to get more into fantasy. I have loved fantasy for years. Fantasy has been my go-to genre for so long. I thought that I would make a video of fantasies for beginners all the way to advanced, what I would consider advanced. I'm gonna go from easy, simple fantasy all the way to high fantasy. You really are delving into a new world. I like the whole gamut of them. Something that you should know about this list, I'm kind of basing them a little bit off of how easy it is to get into the world, how easily the world is explained, also the politics of the world, the romance factor. I will say a lot of the easier ones are ones with heavy romance in them. If you just really like the fantasy romance genre, I've got a list for you. I mean, this is really for anyone who is just starting out in fantasy and is curious about it and wants to find some good series, and for those who have been in it a while and are just looking for more books. Okay, so this list is basically ones I try to stay away from, super popular books, just because I feel like a lot of people already know those fantasy series, and so I'm trying to do ones that aren't quite as popular. Some of these are a bit older, but most of them are fairly new, at least within the last 5 years. So keep that in mind. Something else you'll notice with all of these is that they are all series, which fantasies are just known for being series. Some of them are kind of spin-offs, but for the most part, they are all a continuation of a story. There is no Sarah J. Maas in this list. I adore Sarah J. Maas, but I think everyone already knows about all of her books, so they aren't included in this. I didn't include the Shatter Me series or Lord of the Rings. I didn't include any of those uber famous ones because I just wanted a less known list that maybe will give people an opportunity to try them out. I have 14 different series to talk to you about. Also, something to note, I'm not really going to talk about the background of each book. I'm not going to try and describe to you what goes on in each book. I mean, I will a little bit, but that's just going to take so much time, and this is already going to be a super long video, which, what am I doing? It's my first one. I wanted to provide, I guess, the most that I possibly could. I rushed through these. I'm sorry, just that you can really trust me, but take my word for it. They're good. They're good fantasy books. With that, let's go ahead and get started. So the very first book that is The Curse of the Wolf King by Tessoja Odette. I don't think I said her name right. This is a series, it's called With Fae series. This is one that I actually heard of from Sarah Caroli. This is the first one in the series. This is a Beauty and the Beast retelling. How I graded it is it's very, very easy to read. Romance in it is very prominent, and so if you're looking for a very sweet romance, this is the one to go for. As far as the language in it, the names aren't too confusing, the world isn't too confusing. It's basically our world but different names to it. They do talk about fae, but as far as like world building, it's very much just set in a normal town. So it's not anything where you'd be dealing with anything too political either. It's just about breaking the curse. So this one's very simple. I think I gave this one 3.5. I mean, it's not my favorite, but it's a good one. This is written about a certain couple, and then the next books, how they are written, they're written about different couples that are a part of this one. You probably can read them all as standalones, but I just wanted to start with the first one. So, Curse of the Wolf King. The next one that I am picking is one that may seem a little odd to have in here, but I absolutely love this series. It's just fantasy enough that I think it can be added. It is the Vampire Academy series by Rochelle Mead. This is a series that actually has turned into a TV series, so this one is a bit more prominent. It is a vampire series, and it's basically about a vampire school. What makes this one a bit more difficult than the other ones is there's a lot more titles in it and a lot more like different sections of vampires and different monsters that you kind of have to keep an eye on. But for the most part, this is like set in present time. I mean, they go to malls, they hang out in houses. It's nothing where you're dealing with a lot of differences than what the real world actually is. So it has enough paranormal to it that it's obviously more fantasy. Don't have vampires in real life. If only. Am I right? Okay. This is a really good series. I love this series so much. What I do recommend though is to get through the first 2 books. I feel the third one is really when the series takes off. I think there's 7 or 8 books, but they're fairly easy reads. This is a really good series, very solid, highly recommend. The next book that I'm going to talk about actually comes from the author of the Dance of Thieves duology, which I haven't heard anybody talk about her first trilogy that she wrote. It is The Kiss of Deception by Mary E. Pearson. So this is a part of the Remnant Chronicles, and there are 3 books. These are so good. They are a YA fantasy. In it, there's 3 characters. You've got our main character, the princess, then you've got another character, the thief, who you don't know throughout the whole book who is the thief, and then you've got the prince. Same with him. You don't know who he is. From the princess's perspective, you have 2 men in her life, but the whole time you're trying to figure out who is who. I highly recommend this. This is in a whole new world. I wouldn't necessarily say there's too much fantasy to it as far as like magic, but it seems a bit more set in like the olden times. It really is a good one to just get started in because it's definitely not too complicated. The politics in it isn't too complicated. First book, I don't believe was my favorite, but getting to the second and the third, it just gets stronger and stronger as the series goes. Highly recommend just giving it a shot. Next book that I'm going to talk about, I don't actually physically have. It is A Fate of Wrath and Flame by K.A. Tucker. This is one that is currently being written. I don't know how many books are going to be in this series. The first 2 are out. The third one is coming out this year. This is a fantasy romance, and it is so good because she does something where she kind of cheats the fantasy system in that this isn't a spoiler. So how you start off is you are following this girl. She lives in New York City. I believe it's New York City, and she gets transported into a fantasy world. And when she's transported into this fantasy world, she looks like a princess who lives there that just committed a huge crime. The princess who she looks like just murdered the king and queen, and she is literally just being caught for it, like by the guards. And so she's thrown in jail. And so this girl who was just thrust into this world and is now being tried for a crime that she doesn't even know anything about, you're basically following her the whole time. And so it's a bit of a cheat because the main character doesn't know either what's going on. The whole time she's trying to figure out what world she's in, what she's doing there, why was she chosen to be sent here, and why does she look like the princess? There's also a prince involved whose family was just murdered, and so it's definitely an enemies to lovers type situation. It's really interesting. It's very good. I would say it's more confusing just because of the world that you are in. There's definitely different elements in it that make it a bit more confusing for a fantasy, but it is so good. K.A. Tucker is an author who traditionally just writes contemporary romance, and so her romance in it is so good because she knows how to write it. I feel like nobody has talked about it, and I loved it, so I highly recommend it. I think I gave the last book 4 stars. Give it a shot. It's very good. The next book on this list is Graceling by Kristen Shore. This is a series that I absolutely love. When I first read Graceling, I was in, I think, high school, and it was so good. It is so easy to get into, and the fantasy world is difficult, but because of how it's written, it makes it easy. So that's why it's more on the easier side of this list. So Graceling is basically about this girl named Katsa, and she is a Graceling. And that means they have some type of magical power. It's not a system that is set up like an elemental system or a seasonal system. This is a system where the magic can be whatever. Hers specifically is death. What that means is a variety of things, which sounds like it could be confusing, but I promise you it's not. The hijinks, the things that she does, she is the king's assassin, and so she's a strong female character. There's a little bit of romance in it. This could be read as a standalone. This is probably the closest you'll ever get to a fantasy standalone in this list. And so I highly recommend it. It's so good. It is a YA fantasy. Give it a read. The next book on this list is one that I feel is a bit more popular now, is the Kingdom of the Wicked series by Carrie Maniscalco. This is the first of 3 books. What makes this a good easy fantasy series is the heavy romance in it. This is definitely one that it starts off YA, but then it definitely gets to be adult. This is one I really enjoyed it, especially the first time I read it. As like a starter in the fantasy world, this is such a good one. This is such a solid one, especially if you are looking for a good fantasy romance. It's got witches in it. It's got demons in it, so it's perfect for spooky season too. Love our main character. She is just so fun to follow, and then our main male is delicious. We love him. I probably would give closer to a 4, probably like 3.5 out of 5. World in it is not too difficult to understand. It's set in Italy, but there's different elements to it that make it a bit more magical, especially when you get into the second book. You are then somewhere else. There's a murder mystery element to it as well, and so that just keeps the plot going, and then you've got the side plot of the romance to it, so it's just delicious. Highly recommend Kingdom of the Wicked. So the next book is The High Mountain Court by A.K. Mulford. I have only read this book in the series. I believe there are 4 now that are out. There will be a 5th one, I believe. This is when you're getting into a bit more high fantasy, but not quite. So the politics of it is a bit more in the story. Got a lot of different names and titles that are a bit confusing. So this is when we start to get into a world that's a bit different. As far as like the magic of it, the magic's not that confusing. Fairly simple, especially in this book. You don't get a ton of world building with it, but you are dealing with a prince who is trying to circumvent a war that is gonna happen, and then you've got this red witch who is not supposed to exist anymore, who has been called upon to help this prince. And so this is definitely an adult fantasy romance. Again, spice is in this book, so if that's what you're looking for, I would recommend this just because it's short and it's fairly easy. Not my favorite. I think I gave it 3 stars, but it's still good. It's a solid one. It's well written. I've heard that the second one is better, so that's kind of why I read this one, is so that I can get to the second one. The way that the series is set up is, again, this is another spin-off series where, you know, the first couple is in this one, the next book will be a different couple, and so on and so forth. So, The High Mountain Court. The next book that I'm going to talk about is Guild by Raven Kennedy. This series is so good. I am shocked more people don't talk about this series. It is a adult fantasy romance series. I will say, for those of you who are like, romance, give it to me. It takes a bit. It's a slow burn. It's a slow burn to the romance, so don't expect it in the first book. Kind of expect it in the second book. The third book is like where we start to take off. The fourth book, holy cow. So just keep that in mind if that's why you're going into it. However, the world in it is so fascinating. So it's basically based off of the Greek mythology of Midas, in which Midas is the guy who would touch anything and it would turn into gold. Well, in this story, it's actually one of his favorite golden saddle, which in this world, saddle means prostitute. And she's favored because he touched her and she became gold, and so she was this golden girl, when in reality she's the one with the power to turn things gold. And so Midas keeps her trapped. You've got this huge world that is going on outside of just Midas's kingdom, and you've got King Rot, who has a power of his own and he can rot things. And so there's different elements to it that make it a bit more confusing. There's also the political element that is a bit more confusing, but it is so good. The writing in it is so good. It's really unique in the sense that the magic system is really unique. She does well spelling it out for you, but not so far that it makes you feel dumb, and there's a lot more telling instead of showing. So highly recommend that series. Please read it. It's so good. The next book I'm going to talk about is the Falling Kingdoms series. Now, this is a series where we're getting a lot more into just fantasy focused. So this is a series of, I believe, 7 books. We follow 4 or 5 different characters throughout this entire series, and you get each of their points of views, and each one of them has a really big thing that they are trying to do. And so you have a lot of world building in this, and you've got a lot more politics in this. Now, the nice thing with this is, as far as like the language and the actual politics itself isn't so bad. If you are interested in getting into more of high fantasy stuff, I would consider this, especially since the books are shorter. It is YA. I would check this one out if I were you and you're interested in getting into more of that hero story, more of your classic fantasy. There's a little bit of romance in it, not a ton. It's written very simplistically, so it's not too dense, too difficult to get through, but it's definitely like fantasy. So keep that in mind. The next book is one of my favorite fantasy series of all time, and that is Aragon by Christopher Paolini. Now, you've probably heard of this one. This is probably like the most popular one that I have on this list. However, I feel like it doesn't get the hype that it deserves. This is definitely like fantasy. It's not so difficult because as soon as you get, there's mainly just one big problem that you're trying to solve throughout the entire series. So it's not as episodic as some fantasies are, where you keep getting a bigger and bigger bad guy. You mainly just have one bad guy throughout the whole time. World building is difficult, but once you're in it, it's like you're done. It's not like it keeps expanding, if that makes sense. There's like different monsters in here that is a little bit difficult to keep an eye on. This is definitely more classically written, so it's not as simplistic as, you know, Fallen Kingdoms would be. It definitely has more of like the Hobbit feel to it. I definitely recommend these though, because the story is so good. You follow Aragorn and his dragon Saphira throughout their adventures and throughout them trying to defeat Galbatrix, which is the big bad guy. It's definitely like your classic hero's journey, and because of that, it's just, there's just something so magical about it. If you're wondering about romance, there's really not that much in here, maybe just like a smidgen of romance, but it is fully about Aragorn and his story, and it's just so good. It's like a coming of age story, if you like coming of age stories, but just set in a fantasy world. The next series is one that is we're getting to a lot more tougher fantasies. This one wouldn't necessarily be, or at least I wouldn't consider it a high fantasy, but it is A Darker Shade of Magic by V.E. Schwab. This is a trilogy. She may be coming out with another one at some point, but the magical systems in these are so intricate and fascinating. There's 4 different worlds. There's like a black world, a gray world, a white world, and a red world, and you have a magician, I think, in each one. It's been a long time since I've read these, but this magician can like go from like each one and is kind of the keeper of each world. The world itself is very difficult, but because we're dealing with different realms that we're traveling to, and then the magic itself is very intricate and different. The main character, and so you're seeing most things from his perspective, his point of view. The story is so good. It's written so beautifully. The magic system itself isn't one that you will have ever seen before, and so it'll be different. The plot itself will hold you, even if you do get like kind of confused. The plot is so good, the characters are so good, you'll keep following along. It won't be that big of a deal, but it's definitely a harder one. Definitely recommend. Such a good trilogy. I need to reread it. This next one is a big one. It is Empire of the Vampire by Jay Kristoff. This, honey, is huge. It's a big boy, so that's part of the reason why it's a bit harder. So this is obviously a vampire book. It is a gothic fantasy horror book. It's if Game of Thrones and Name of the Wind had a baby, it would be this book. You follow Gabriel, our main character, through his life, him retelling his own life to a vampire, and Gabriel is a vampire slayer. There's a lot of religious imagery, there's a lot of gothic imagery. You're jumping through different time periods in Gabriel's life, and so that, as well as the world that you are in, as well as the different monsters and different people that you encounter, makes it a harder book to get through. However, the story, so good. Oh my goodness, I cried while reading this book. It's just so intense and so gritty, but also like there's moments of humor in it. There's moments of just, you just love Gabriel, even when he's, you know, young and super idealistic to when he's older and very jaded. It's the only one that's out so far. There's a second one is supposed to be coming out. I don't know when. I like this book. I like the way he writes. If an author can make me feel something while reading his book or their book, it means something to me, and Empire of the Vampire did that. So I highly recommend, in regards to people who are looking for a gothic fantasy story, one with another, more of an anti-hero arc in it, a more dense fantasy book. We only have 2 books left The second to last book is one that is my favorite. It is right now my absolute favorite high fantasy series. If you like high fantasy, go pick it up. If you don't like high fantasy, go pick it up. That's how intensely I love this book. And it is City of Brass by, her name is Shannon Chakraborty. I don't think I have read something this good that like made me feel so much throughout the entire trilogy like this one did. And I was shocked with how much I liked it. I went into it thinking like, oh, it'll be fun, it'll be a nice story, no big deal. But no, I fell in love with the characters. Throughout this book, you follow 3 characters, Ali, Nahiri, and Dara. I believe it's based on Middle Eastern folklore. You have tons and tons of politics. I'm not typically one to enjoy politics that heavy in a book, but this holds on to you. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's the characters, maybe it's the character arc. They're all relatable, and so there's just something so relatable to these characters, even though they are in this fantasy world. If you're not going to read any of the books, read this one. This is the only one that I'm going to say you have to read. You've just got this beloved story of people just trying to do their best, really, and how different everyone thinks their best is. Just a lot of political intrigue, a lot of adventures. Highly, highly recommend City of Brass. Finally, into the last book of this list. It's another kind of popular one, I would say, and it is Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. Now, the reason why I put this one at the top is because I believe it is even classified as just your classic high fantasy. Patrick Rothfuss is a well-known high fantasy author. It's been a while since I've read this one. However, I remember just how endearing the character is. It reminds me a lot of Aragon in the sense of, you know, your more classic fantasy. However, this one is a lot more involved just because you have a very intricate magical system. You've got a very intricate world. It's kind of like Empire the Vampire, where you've got your main author basically retelling his story to someone else. Go from his adolescence to 20s, later 20s in this one. Patrick has not finished this series, so go into it knowing that. This one is, yeah, just more of your classic high fantasy, which makes it a bit more difficult. The political system, the magic system, the languages, the different titles, the different creatures that are in it. There's just a lot of world there. You've got a school that you go to, and so you got to learn about the school. There's just a lot of elements in this that make it a lot more dense. I always find with fantasy, it's not as much about the world itself or even the magic system as it is about the characters and the plot. Even if you can't fully understand what's happening as far as the magic, the plot will hold you and keep you. So, The Name of the Wind. Okay, and that is it. We did it. Oh my gosh, that took forever. That's the whole list. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope for those of you who are interested in fantasy, maybe we'll pick up some of the beginner books, or those of you who are more in the middle, want to just challenge yourselves, read some more of these expert, quote-unquote, expert high fantasy books. Remember, all of this is just my own opinion, so other people can have their own opinion about any of these books, of whether or not they think they're even fantasy. This is just my personal list. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope maybe you'll come back again. We'll see if I make another one of these videos. Thank you for joining me. I guess get out there. Get you some fantasy books and we'll see what happens. Okay.